The night our company lost $3,200,000,000 in Europe began when someone pulled my chair away from the table. It was not a boardroom decision, nor was it a sudden market crash. It was just a single chair at a VIP table in Manhattan. The grand ballroom of the Arden Hotel glowed under massive crystal chandeliers, casting a warm amber light over the investors who filled the room. These were prominent executives from both sides of the Atlantic, representing American logistics firms, German manufacturers, and private equity partners. Discussing expansion corridors across Europe, the annual European Industrial Investor Gala was meant to celebrate partnerships like that. But tonight, one partnership mattered more than all the others. Somewhere in the room sat the man controlling a $3,200,000,000 industrial expansion contract. Heinrich Lindner, chairman of Lindner Manufacturing. Heinrich was a traditionalist who did not trust slick PowerPoint presentations. He trusted people. He believed that agreements were only as good as the character of the individuals who stood behind them. And he had built his entire manufacturing empire on that simple philosophy. My name is Julian Vance. At 48 years old, I had spent nearly 2 decades working inside the European industrial network. Most executives only saw through spreadsheets. I had spent my career visiting factory towns in Bavaria, logistics hubs outside Leipzig, and small offices where family manufacturers still built partnerships over long dinners instead of slideshows. I had walked the factory floors, spoken with the engineers in their own language, and learned the intricate details of their supply chain challenges. For 12 years, Heinrich Lindner and I had built that partnership together. It was a relationship constructed on quarterly meetings, factory visits, and quiet handshakes before contracts were ever signed. That was how trust worked in the German industrial world. When I arrived at the VIP table that evening, the place card waiting there read Julian Vance. I sat down and began reviewing my notes, preparing for the arrival of the German delegation. Several junior executives glanced at the card, then at me. I recognized the look immediately. It was the look people give when they think someone is sitting somewhere they do not belong, especially a senior relationship manager who valued field work over corporate office politics and expensive suits. Then a shadow fell across the table, and a cold, commanding voice spoke behind my chair. The voice belonged to Preston Cole, Senior Vice President of Global Strategy. Preston stood behind my chair with the relaxed confidence of someone used to being obeyed without question. He was 34 years old, wore a tailored 3-piece suit, and carried himself with an arrogance that only came from a lifetime of privilege and an elite business school degree. He glanced down at the place card, then back at me. He announced to the surrounding tables that this seat was for Chloe. Conversations nearby slowed as other guests turned to look. Behind Preston stood a young woman clutching a tablet. Her badge read Chloe Reynolds, Strategy Intern. She gave me an uncertain, nervous smile. I did not move. Instead, I turned the place card slightly so he could see it. I told him that my name was printed on the card and that I had been assigned this seat weeks ago. Preston barely looked down. He replied that the arrangement had changed. He gestured toward Chloe and stated that she would be handling the European partnership moving forward. A quiet murmur moved through the room as executives at nearby tables turned to watch the unfolding drama. Preston continued calmly, explaining that our company was moving away from single-point relationship dependency. He claimed that clients should not depend on personalities but should depend on corporate systems. He snapped his fingers toward an analyst near the wall, calling for Toby to bring the deck. A thin folder appeared in his hand. Across the first page was printed Scalable Client Relationship Model. Below it sat a chart replacing my name with a process framework. Preston closed the folder and told me it was nothing personal, just the inevitable evolution of corporate efficiency. Then he turned toward the waiter beside the table. He instructed the waiter to help me move my things to a table in the back of the room near the kitchen doors. The waiter hesitated, looking uncomfortable. Preston placed his hand on the back of my chair and pulled it slightly away from the table. He told Chloe to go ahead and take the seat. Chloe stepped forward and sat down, looking down at her tablet to avoid eye contact. Phones lifted around the room as other guests began texting about the scene. Someone whispered behind me, asking if I was part of the staff. Another voice said quietly that I had just been removed from my own seat. I stood up, keeping my composure despite the anger burning in my chest. Preston adjusted his cufflinks and thanked me for being flexible. That was when I looked him directly in the eyes. I told him that if this was how he wanted to run things, he could forget about the $3,200,000,000 waiting in Europe. Preston froze, his smug expression faltering for a fraction of a second. I picked up my coat and walked toward the exit without looking back. 30 minutes later, the ballroom doors opened again, and Heinrich Lindner walked in, completely unaware of the disaster that had just been set in motion by an executive who valued charts over character. Before the gala had even begun, I spent hours in my Manhattan hotel room reviewing the technical specifications of the new manufacturing lines that Heinrich Lindner was planning to install in Leipzig. For 12 years, our partnership had succeeded because I did not just manage accounts from a distance. I understood the mechanical tolerances of their machinery, the logistical challenges of their shipping routes, and the personal dynamics of their factory managers. The previous year, when a supply bottleneck threatened to delay a major shipment of custom valves, I did not send a generic email. I had boarded a flight to Munich, driven 3 hours through a snowstorm to the factory, and worked alongside their plant manager until we found a solution. That was the level of dedication that Heinrich expected, and it was the reason why he had refused to sign agreements with any of our competitors. He knew that when crises arose, he could rely on a partner who was willing to get his hands dirty, rather than a corporate office in New York that managed relationships through automated dashboards. The ballroom never fully returned to normal after I left. Conversations restarted, but every so often, someone glanced toward the exit where I had departed. Preston Cole appeared completely unconcerned. He had taken the empty chair beside Chloe Reynolds and resumed speaking with the investors across the table, explaining his new strategy model. From a distance, everything looked almost normal again, almost. 30 minutes later, the ballroom doors opened. Several European executives near the entrance stood automatically. The German delegation had arrived. At the center of the group walked a tall, silver-haired man, Heinrich Lindner, chairman of Lindner Manufacturing. He was 65 years old, dressed in a simple but bespoke dark suit, and carried himself with a quiet authority that commanded the room. His company supplied vital components used across half of Europe's industrial manufacturing sector. More importantly, the partnership he was negotiating that night represented $3,200,000,000 in future contracts, which meant nearly every executive in the room suddenly cared where he sat. Heinrich approached the VIP table, flanked by 3 senior directors from his firm. His eyes moved across the seats, scanning the names, 1, 2, 3, then he stopped. The chair where I had been sitting was now occupied by Chloe. She straightened nervously under his cold, analytical gaze. Heinrich looked at her, then he looked at Preston. Silence settled across the table. Finally, Heinrich spoke, his voice low and measured. He asked where Julian Vance was. Preston stood immediately, extending his hand. He welcomed Heinrich and introduced himself as Preston Cole, Senior Vice President of Global Strategy. Heinrich nodded once, but he did not take Preston's hand. His eyes did not move from the empty space. He repeated his question, asking again where Julian Vance was. Preston hesitated, the confidence in his eyes wavering for a brief second. Preston then gestured toward Chloe. He explained that the company had restructured the relationship and that the strategy division would now coordinate communications. Chloe nodded quickly and said she was pleased to meet him, her voice trembling slightly. Heinrich looked at her for several seconds, then back at Preston. The silence grew uncomfortable, spreading to the adjacent tables until the hum of the ballroom died down. Preston continued explaining, saying that Julian Vance had previously managed the relationship, but that they were transitioning to a scalable client structure. He tapped the presentation folder lightly and stated that their systems now managed the partnership. Chloe nodded again, though it was clear she did not fully understand the situation unfolding before her eyes. Heinrich remained completely still. Around the table, several executives exchanged uneasy glances, recognizing the storm that was about to break. Finally, Heinrich spoke. He stated that Preston had replaced me. It was not a question, but a cold final realization. Preston gave a small shrug and replied that they had simply updated the organizational structure. Another long pause followed. Heinrich slowly buttoned his jacket. He stated that for 15 years he had worked with our company. The room had grown still enough that every word carried clearly. He remarked that 15 years of meetings, factory visits, and quarterly planning had all involved one person, Julian Vance. Preston nodded, attempting to speak, but Heinrich raised one hand slightly to silence him. He looked directly at Preston. He stated that Preston believed this relationship belonged to the company, but in Germany, business was built differently. He looked Preston dead in the eye and said that trust is not transferable. The words hung in the air like lead. Heinrich continued, speaking with a cold intensity that made the surrounding executives hold their breath. He asked Preston who would answer the phone at 3 in the morning when a shipping container was blocked at the port of Hamburg. He asked if their scalable client model would wake up and coordinate with the German customs officers, or if Chloe would handle the emergency logistics using her tablet. Preston opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Heinrich turned toward the exit. He announced that the meeting was finished. He did not raise his voice. He simply turned and walked away from the table. Behind him, the room remained silent, long enough for everyone to understand what had just happened. The largest deal of the night had just walked out of the ballroom, and the person who could have stopped it was already driving away. As Heinrich Lindner walked away, his delegation followed him in a silent, coordinated column that spoke volumes to everyone remaining in the room. The local investors at the adjacent tables looked at their plates, avoiding eye contact with Preston Cole, who was still standing next to the strategy intern. The silence in the ballroom was deafening, broken only by the quiet clinking of silver cutlery and the distant hum of traffic from the street outside. Preston Cole tried to maintain his composure, turning to the table and speaking in a forced, jovial tone about how the German manufacturing sector was notoriously slow to adapt to modern operational practices, but his words carried no weight. The other executives at the table began quietly checking their phones, sending messages to their partners about the sudden collapse of the Lindner negotiations. Within minutes, the atmosphere at Table 7 had become toxic, and it was clear to everyone present that the strategic restructuring had not optimized the partnership, but had instead completely destroyed it. I was already driving south along the Hudson River when the gala ended. The Manhattan skyline reflected across the windshield as traffic moved slowly through the late evening streets. For the first time that night, the car was quiet. No investors, no presentation decks, no executives explaining why replacing a relationship with a system was supposed to make sense. Preston Cole believed partnerships could be managed the way software manages data, using flowcharts, process diagrams, and PowerPoint frameworks. But the European industrial network did not work like that. Most American executives never saw the places where those partnerships actually began, such as the factory towns outside Munich, the engineering plants in Bavaria, and the family companies where the same surname had been running the business for 3 generations. These were places where contracts did not start with spreadsheets. They started with reputation. 18 years earlier, I had learned that lesson the slow way. I did not learn it in boardrooms, but in manufacturing offices where owners still shook hands before lawyers wrote anything down. Over time, those conversations became relationships, and those relationships became contracts. Many of the largest agreements our company held in Europe existed for one reason: because the people on the other side trusted the person sitting across the table. Me. Preston thought removing me solved a risk problem. What he did not understand was something much more dangerous. Some relationships are not part of the system. They are the system. My phone vibrated on the passenger seat. I glanced down at the screen. The name displayed there made me slow the car slightly. Heinrich Lindner. I pulled the car to the side of the road before answering. For a moment I simply looked at the screen, letting the phone ring. Then I picked up the phone. I wished him a good evening. There was a short pause on the line. Then Heinrich spoke. He told me that he had left the dinner. I nodded to myself, saying I assumed he might. Another pause followed. Then Heinrich said something that changed everything. He stated that he would not continue negotiations with my company. The $3,200,000,000 partnership was over, and the consequences were only beginning. For several seconds after Heinrich spoke, neither of us said anything. Traffic moved slowly along the Hudson, the city lights reflecting across the water while his words settled in the quiet of the car. The partnership was gone, not because of pricing or product quality, but because the person he trusted had been humiliated and pushed aside. Heinrich spoke again. He said that in his country, business is built between people. He explained that he had worked with my company for 15 years because he trusted me. He recalled the time in 2016 when a logistics strike in France threatened to halt their entire automotive supply chain, and I had personally spent 48 hours on the phone coordinating alternative routes through Switzerland to keep their production line running. That, he said, was not something a system could replicate. There was another short pause. Then he added that when I decided where I was going next, I should call him. The lines went silent. Heinrich ended phone calls the same way he ended meetings. No long farewells, just the quiet click of a decision already made. I sat there for a moment looking out at the dark river. Then my phone vibrated again. Another name appeared on the screen. Stefan Bayer, Chief Executive Officer of Bayer Industrial Group, one of the fastest-growing manufacturing alliances in Europe and our company's fiercest competitor. I answered. Stefan told me immediately that he had just heard what happened in Manhattan. News traveled quickly in the industrial world. Executives talked, procurement directors compared notes, and stories moved quietly across networks that had existed for decades. Stefan said he had been trying to recruit me for years and that tonight simply made the timing obvious. I leaned back in the seat and asked what exactly he was offering. Stefan did not hesitate. He offered me the position of head of European operations with full authority to build the network exactly as I saw fit. He paused, then added that we both knew if Lindner walked away from Bradley Industrial, he would not walk away from me. For the first time that night, I smiled. Stefan Bayer understood what Preston Cole never would. In Europe, relationships do not disappear, they move. While the headlights of my sedan cut through the light rain falling along the highway, I reflected on the warnings my retired mentor had given me years ago. He had always said that the greatest threat to a successful enterprise did not come from market fluctuations or technological disruptions, but from the hubris of young executives who believed that spreadsheets could capture the complexity of human trust. He had warned me that a day would come when a new generation of managers would look at a 20-year relationship and see nothing but an unnecessary expense that could be streamlined out of its existence. I had listened to his advice, but I had never truly believed it until I felt Preston Cole's hand on the back of my VIP chair. Now, as the rain streaked across the glass, I realized that my mentor was right. The corporate office had forgotten that business was not conducted between logos, but between people, and their ignorance had cost them the foundation of their European division. In the next morning, the corporate headquarters of Bradley Industrial Holdings was in a state of absolute chaos. The news of Heinrich Lindner's sudden departure had reached the board of directors before the markets even opened. Roger Bradley, the chief executive officer, had called an emergency meeting. The stock of Bradley Industrial was already beginning to slip in pre-market trading, and the board members were demanding answers. Preston Cole spent the morning trying to spin the situation, claiming that the German delegation was simply using a negotiating tactic, and that they would return to the table once they realized our systems were superior. But Roger Bradley was not buying it. He knew that a $3,200,000,000 hole in their European pipeline would devastate their annual earnings. Rather than addressing the root cause of the problem, Roger and Preston decided to play hardball. They believed they could pressure me into returning, or at least prevent me from joining a competitor. On Thursday afternoon, a courier delivered a heavy envelope to my home. Inside was a formal cease and desist letter from the legal department of Bradley Industrial Holdings. The letter asserted that I was in possession of proprietary trade secrets, including client contact lists, procurement schedules, and strategic pricing models. It also threatened to enforce a strict 3-year non-compete and non-solicitation agreement that I had signed 12 years ago when I was promoted to Director of European Relations. The letter warned that if I accepted employment with any competitor, including Bayer Industrial Group, they would sue me for tens of millions of dollars in damages and seek an immediate injunction to block my employment. I immediately called my attorney, Gavin Thorne. Gavin was a veteran corporate litigator who specialized in employment law and contract disputes. We met at his office downtown the following morning. I handed him the cease and desist letter and my copy of the original employment agreement. Gavin put on his reading glasses and studied the documents in silence for nearly an hour, occasionally making notes on a yellow pad. When he finally looked up, a thin smile sat on his face. Gavin told me that the legal threats from Bradley Industrial were not only empty, but they were also a major tactical blunder. He explained that the non-compete and non-solicitation agreement was legally void ab initio, meaning it was completely void and non-existent from the very beginning. He pointed out two fatal flaws in the contract. First, the agreement had been forced upon me mid-employment when I was promoted, but the company had failed to provide any fresh consideration. Under state law, a restrictive covenant signed after the initial hiring is invalid unless the employee receives a distinct, valuable benefit in return, such as a sign-on bonus, equity shares, or a specialized promotion package. In my case, they had simply increased my workload and adjusted my title without any new consideration. Second, the geographic scope of the non-compete was defined as any territory worldwide where the company hopes to conduct operations in the next 20 years. Gavin explained that courts routinely strike down such broad, speculative geographic restrictions as unreasonable and unenforceable. Furthermore, Gavin noted that Preston Cole's public demotion and constructive discharge of me at the gala constituted a material breach of the covenant of good faith and fair dealing, which legally discharged any remaining duties I might have owed to the company. But Gavin was not finished. He suggested that we go on the offensive. He pointed out that by unilaterally removing the key relationship manager and insulting a client controlling a $3.2 billion contract, Preston Cole and Roger Bradley had acted with gross negligence. Gavin suggested that we draft a formal response to the legal department, copying the board of directors. In the letter, we would outline why the non-compete was void ab initio and inform the board that if they attempted to file a lawsuit, we would countersue for constructive discharge and tortious interference. More importantly, we would alert the board that Roger Bradley and Preston Cole had committed a severe breach of fiduciary duty to the company's shareholders by intentionally dismantling a multi-billion-dollar account without board approval. Gavin smiled and said that once the board members realized their executive officers had exposed them to shareholder lawsuits and lost their largest client, the cease and desist letter would disappear very quickly. Gavin Thorne pointed to a specific paragraph in the original agreement that had been drafted by a junior attorney 12 years ago. He explained that the contract had been written with such broad language that it practically prohibited me from working in the entire field of industrial logistics anywhere on the continent of Europe. He noted that U.S. courts had established a clear precedent that restrictive covenants must be tailored to protect legitimate business interests rather than simply crushing competition or preventing former employees from earning a living. Because the company had attempted to restrict my employment on a global scale for 3 years without providing any compensation or stock options, the entire agreement violated public policy. Gavin assured me that any judge who looked at the contract would throw it out of court immediately, rendering it completely void ab initio. This legal analysis gave me the confidence I needed to move forward with Stefan Bayer without any fear of their threats. Gavin's prediction was entirely accurate. 3 days after my attorney sent our response to the legal department and the board of directors, the threats of litigation ceased. The board members, horrified by the revelation that the non-compete was void ab initio and terrified of a potential shareholder lawsuit for breach of fiduciary duty, ordered the legal team to back down immediately. They realized that any public legal battle would only draw more attention to the disastrous decisions made by Roger Bradley and Preston Cole, further damaging the company's stock price. With the legal obstacles removed, I officially signed my new contract with Bayer Industrial Group as the president of European operations. My first official act was to schedule a formal meeting with Heinrich Lindner. We met in the quiet, glass-walled conference room at Bayer Industrial's headquarters in Frankfurt, overlooking the River Main. There were no elaborate presentations, no interns holding tablets, and no strategies designed by people who had never stepped foot on a factory floor. We sat at a long wooden table, drank coffee, and discussed the transition. Heinrich placed the final contract on the table. He stated that Lindner Manufacturing was officially transferring its entire procurement agreement to Bayer Industrial Group. The total value of the contract was the exact same number that had disappeared from Bradley Industrial, $3.2 billion. Heinrich smiled and said that in his country, trust moves faster than paperwork. He signed his name to the document, solidifying the partnership. But the consequences did not stop with that single contract. Germany's industrial manufacturing sector operated like an interconnected ecosystem. Procurement directors at other firms closely monitored Lindner's moves. When news spread that Heinrich Lindner had moved his entire supply chain to Bayer Industrial because of the way Bradley Industrial had treated their key contact, other European clients began to follow. Within 6 weeks, 3 other major manufacturers terminated their agreements with Bradley Industrial, citing a lack of trusted operational oversight. In total, the European revenue losses for Bradley Industrial Holdings escalated to over $4 billion by the end of the quarter. The financial fallout was swift and severe. When the quarterly reports were released, the massive drop in European revenue sent shockwaves through the market. The stock price of Bradley Industrial plummeted by 28% in a single week. The board of directors took immediate action. During an emergency shareholder meeting, Roger Bradley was stripped of his chief executive officer title and forced into early retirement. Preston Cole was terminated immediately, escorted out of the building by security guards with his personal items packed in a cardboard box. Chloe Reynolds, the strategy intern, was reassigned to a domestic administrative pool, far away from any international partnerships. The scalable systems model they had championed was abandoned, replaced once again by the traditional, relationship-based management structure they had tried to destroy. 3 months later, I relocated to Stuttgart to oversee the expansion of Bayer Industrial's new European Operations Center. The office was located near the heart of the region's manufacturing district, surrounded by the engineering firms and factory complexes that drove the German economy. That evening, I walked into a quiet restaurant near the city center. I had reserved a private dining room with a long oak table and a bottle of local wine waiting. Heinrich Lindner was already there. He stood up as I entered, and we shook hands warmly. We spent the evening discussing production schedules and logistics, the kind of detailed work that actually built businesses. As we raised our glasses to the future, I thought about the night in Manhattan. Preston Cole thought he was simply replacing a seat at a table. He never understood that the seat did not matter. It was the person sitting in it who held the entire business together. The transition of the Lindner account was completed in less than 30 days, a record speed for an industrial agreement of that scale. Inside Bayer Industrial Group, my new team worked late into the night to ensure that the logistics corridors were set up exactly as Heinrich Lindner required, showing him the personal attention that he had missed during his final months with Bradley Industrial. As the months passed, the new operations center in Stuttgart grew from a small regional branch into a major hub, employing 40 people and managing supply chains across 5 European countries. During our dinner, Heinrich looked out the window at the city lights and remarked that the corporate world often forgot that a business was like a living organism, requiring careful cultivation and mutual respect to survive. We raised our glasses once more, knowing that we had not only saved a vital industrial partnership, but had also proved that trust and integrity still held real value in a marketplace dominated by spreadsheets and systems.